Lessons 5 to 7 of the History of London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ruth Golding. The History of London by Walter Besant. Lesson 5. After the Romans, Part 1. The Romans left London. That was early in the 5th century, probably in the year 410. 200 years later we find the East Saxons in London. What happened during this long interval of 7 generations? Not a word reaches us of London for 200 years, except once, when, after a defeat of the British by the Saxons at Crayford in the year 457, we read that the fugitives crossed over London Bridge to take refuge within the walls of the city. What happened during this 200 years? Footnote: on this subject, see the author's book London, Chatto and Windus. End of footnote. We know what happened with other cities. Anderida, now called Pevensey, was taken by the Saxons, and all its inhabitants, man, woman, and child, were slaughtered, so that it became a waste until the Normans built a castle within the old walls. Canterbury, Silchester, Porchester, Colchester, all were taken, their people massacred, the walls left standing, the streets left desolate. For the English, the Saxons, loved not city walls. Therefore we might reasonably conclude that the same thing happened to London. But if it be worthy of the chronicler to note the massacre of Anderida, a small seaport, why should he omit the far more important capture of Augusta? Let us hear what history has to tell. Times full of trouble fell upon the country. Long before the Romans went away, the Picts and Scots were pouring their wild hordes over the north and west, sometimes getting as far south as the Middlesex Forest, murdering and destroying. As early as the year 368, 40 years before they left the country, the Romans sent an expedition north to drive back these savages. Already the Saxons, the Jutes, and the Angles were sending piratical expeditions to harry the coast and even to make settlements. The arm of the Roman was growing weak. It could not stretch out so far. The fleets of the Romans, under the officer called the Count of the Saxon Shore, whose duty was to guard the eastern and southern coasts, were destroyed and their commander slain. So that with foes on the eastern seaboard, foes in the Channel, foes in the river, foes in the north and west, it is certain that the trade of Augusta was declining long before the city was left to defend itself. What sort of defence were the people likely to offer? For nearly 400 years they had lived at peace, free to grow rich and luxurious, with mercenaries to fight for them. Between the taking of the city by Boadicea and the departure of the Romans, a space of 350 years, the peace of the city was only disturbed by the lawlessness of Allectus's mercenaries. Their attempt to sack the city was put down, it is significant to note, not by the citizens, but by the Roman soldiers who entered the city in time. The citizens were mostly merchants. They were Christians in name and in form of worship. They were superstitious, they were luxurious, they were unwarlike. Many of them were not Britons at all, but foreigners settled in the city for trade. Moreover, for it is not true that the whole British people had grown unfit for war, a revolt of the Roman legions in the year 407 drew a large number of the young men into their ranks. And when Constantine the usurper took them over into Gaul for the 4 years' fighting which followed, the country was drained of its best fighting material. The city, then, contained a large number of wealthy merchants, native and foreign. It also contained a great many slaves, who were occupied in the conduct of the trade. And few, since the young men went away with Constantine, who could be relied upon to fight. One more point may be made out from history. Since London was a town which then, as now, lived entirely by its trade, and was the centre of the export and import trade of the whole country, the merchants, as we have seen, must have suffered most severely long before the Romans went away. We are, therefore, in the year 410, facing a situation full of menace. The Picts and Scots are overrunning the whole of the north. The Saxons are harrying the east and the south east. Trade is dying. There is little demand for imports. There are few exports. It is useless for ships to wait cargoes which never arrive. It is useless for ships to bring cargoes for which there is no demand. A declining city, a dying trade, enemies in all directions, an unwarlike population. When the curtain falls upon the scene in the year 410, that is what we see. End of Lesson 5. Lesson 6. After the Romans, Part 2. Consider again the position of London. It stood, as you have seen, originally on two low hills overlooking the river. A strong wall, built all along the bank from Blackfriars, now so called, to the present site of the Tower, kept the river from swamping the houses and wharves which sprang up behind this wall. The walls of the city later on, but only about 50 years before the Romans went away, enclosed a large area covered over with streets, narrow near the river and broad farther north, and with residences, warehouses, villas and workshops. There was probably a population of 70,000 or even more. On the west, in the direction of Westminster, the city wall overlooked an immense marsh. On the south, across the river, there was a still broader and longer marsh. On the east there was another great marsh, with the sea overflowing the sedgy meadows at every high tide. On the north there was a wild moor, and beyond the moor there was an immense forest. 4 roads, not counting the riverway, kept the city in communication with the rest of the island. The most important of these roads was that afterwards called Watling Street, which passed out at Newgate and led across the heart of the country to Chester and Wales, to York and the north. The second, afterwards called Ermine Street, left the city at Bishopsgate and ran through Lincoln to York. A third road, called the Vicinal Way, ran into the eastern counties, and by way of London Bridge, Watling Street was connected with Dover. London, therefore, standing in its marshes, had no means of providing for itself. All the food for its great population was imported. It was brought on pack-asses along these roads. It came from the farms and gardens of the country inland by means of these high roads, strong, broad, and splendid roads, as good as any we have since succeeded in making. In peaceful times, these roads were crowded all the way from Chester and Lincoln and Dover, with long trains of animals laden with provisions for the people of London, as well as with goods for export from the port of London. They were met by long trains of animals laden with imports being carried to their destination. The Thames, in the same way, was filled with barges laden with provisions, as well as with goods going down the river to the people and the port of London. Below Bridge, the river was filled with merchant ships bringing cargoes of wine and spices and costly things to be exchanged for skins and slaves and metals. Let us remember that the daily victualling of 70,000 people means an immense service. We are so accustomed to find everything ready to hand in cities containing millions, as well as in villages of hundreds, that we forget the magnitude of this service. No mind can conceive the magnitude of the food supply of modern London, Paris, New York, or even such towns as Portsmouth, Plymouth, Bristol. Yet try to understand what it means to feed every day, without interruption, only a small town of 70,000 people. So much bread for every day, so much meat, so much fish, so much wine, beer, mead or cider, because at no time did people drink water if they could get anything else. So much milk, honey, butter, cheese, eggs, poultry, geese and ducks. So much beans, peas, salad, fruit. All this had to be brought in regularly, daily. There was salted meat for winter, there was dried fish when fresh could not be procured, there were granaries of wheat to provide for emergencies. All the rest had to be provided day by day. First, the East Saxons, settling in Essex and spreading over the whole of that county, stopped the supplies and the trade over all the eastern counties. Then the Jutes, landing on the Isle of Thanet, stopped the ships that went up and down the river. They also spread over the south country and stopped the supplies that formerly came over London Bridge. Then the Picts and Scots, followed by more Saxons, harassed the north and middle of the island, and no more supplies came down Watling Street. Lastly, the enemy, pressing northward from the south shore, gained the middle reaches of the Thames, and no more supplies came down the river. London was thus deprived of food as well as of trade. This slowly, not suddenly, came to pass. First one source of supply was cut off, then another. First trade declined in one quarter, then it ceased in that quarter altogether. Next another quarter was attacked. The foreign merchants, since there was no trade left, went on board their own ships and disappeared. Whether they succeeded in passing through the pirate craft that crowded the mouth of the river, one knows not. The bones of many lie at the bottom of the sea off the Nore. They vanished from hapless Augusta. They came back no more. Who were left? The native merchants. Despair was in their hearts. Starvation threatened them, even amid the dainty appointments of their luxurious villas. What is the use of marble baths and silken hangings, tessellated pavements, and pictures and books and statues, if there is no food to be had, though one bid for it all the pictures in the house? With the merchants there were the priests, the physicians, the lawyers, the actors and mimics, the artists, the teachers, all who minister to religion, luxury and culture. There were next the great mass of the people, the clerks and scribes, the craftsmen, the salesmen, the lightermen, stevedores, boatmen, marine storekeepers, makers of ship's gear, porters, slaves for the most part, all from highest to lowest, plunged into helplessness. Whither could they fly for refuge? Upon whom could they call for help? End of Lesson 6. Lesson 7. After the Romans, Part 3. Abroad, the Roman Empire was breaking up. The whole of Europe was covered with war. Revolts of conquered tribes, rebellions of successful generals, invasions of savages, the murders of usurpers, the sacking of cities. Rome itself was sacked by Alaric. The conquest of one country after another made of this period the darkest in the history of the world. From over the seas no help, the enemy blocking the mouth of the river, all the roads closed and all the farms destroyed. There came a day at length when it was at last apparent that no more supplies would reach the city. Then the people began to leave the place. Better to fight their way across the country to the west, where the Britons still held their own, than to stay and starve. The men took their arms. They carried little treasure with them, because treasure would be of no use to them on their way. Their wives and children, ladies as delicate and as helpless as any of our own time, children as unfit as our own to face the miseries of cold and hunger and nakedness. And they went out by the gate of Watling Street, not all together, not the whole population, but in small companies for greater safety. They left the city by the gate. They did not journey along the road, but for safety turned aside into the great forest, and so, marching across moors and marshes, past burned homesteads and ruined villages, and farm buildings thrown down, those of them who did not perish by the way under the enemy's sword, or by malarious fever, or by starvation, reached the Severn and the border of the mountains where the Saxon could not penetrate. There was left behind a remnant. After every massacre or exodus there is always left a remnant. The people who stayed in the city were only a few, and those of the baser sort, protected by their wretchedness and poverty. No one would kill those who offer no defence and have no treasures, and their condition under any new masters would be no worse. They shut the gates and barred them. They closed and barred the bridge. They took out of the houses anything that they wanted, the soft warm mantles, the woollen garments, the coverlets, the pillows and hangings, but they abode in their hovels near the river banks. As for the works of art, the pictures, statues and tessellated pavements, these they left where they found them, or for wantonness destroyed them. They fished in the river for their food. They hunted over the marshes, where are now Westminster, Battersea, and Lambeth. The years passed by, and no one disturbed them. They still crouched in their huts, while the thin veneer of civilization was gradually lost, with whatever arts they had learned, and all their religion, except the terror of the unknown. Meanwhile the roofs of the villas and churches fell in, the walls decayed, the gardens were overgrown. Augusta, the proud and stately Augusta, was reduced to a wall enclosing a heap of ruins, with a few savages huddled together in hovels by the riverside. For the East Saxon had overrun Essex, the Jute covered Kent and Surrey, the South Saxon held Sussex, the West Saxon held Wessex. All around, on every side, London was surrounded by the conqueror of the land. Why then did they not take London? Because London was deserted. There was nothing to take. London was silent. No ships going up or down the river reminded the Saxon of the city. It lay amid its marshes and its moors, the old roads choked and overgrown. It was forgotten. It was what the Saxons had already made of Canterbury and Anderida, a waste Chester, that is, a desolated stronghold. Augusta was forgotten. This is the story that we learn from the actual site of London, its position among marshes, the conditions under which alone the people could be maintained. How long did this oblivion continue? No one knows when it began or when it ended. As I read the story of the past, I find a day towards the close of the 6th century when there appeared within sight of the deserted walls a company of East Saxons. They were hunting. They were armed with spears. They followed the chase through the great forest, afterwards called the Middlesex Forest, Epping Forest, Hainault Forest, and across the marshes of the River Lee, full of sedge and reed and treacherous quagmires. And they saw before them the grey walls of a great city of which they had never heard. They advanced cautiously. They found themselves on a firm road, the vicinal way, covered with grass. They expected the sight of an enemy on the wall. None appeared. The gates were closed. The timbers were rotten and fell down at a touch. The men broke through and found themselves among the streets of a city all in ruins. They ran about, shouting. No one appeared. The city was deserted. They went away and told what they had found. But Augusta had perished. When the City appears again, it is under its more ancient name. It is again London. End of Lesson 7. Recording by Ruth Golding.